The Nuremberg Trials. When people think about the punishment of the Nazis, they usually think of those world-famous trials against the cruelest and most powerful Nazi leaders. After all, the Allies wanted to show that they were not tyrants themselves, and that despite the Nazis' horrific crimes, they wanted to convict them through normal legal procedures and the rule of law. But as we will show you in this video, not every Nazi criminal received such humane treatment. Some of the worst and cruelest Nazis were, in fact, subjected to the very same things they had done to others. Just look at the case of Amon Goeth. The extremely sadistic commandant of the Płaszów concentration camp was responsible for countless brutal murders and repeatedly shot prisoners himself, completely at random, from the balcony of his villa. Even so, he was actually supposed to meet a quick and almost painless end on the gallows. But when he was to be hanged in Krakow in 1946, his executioners made a mistake. The rope was too weak for his weight and snapped when the trapdoor opened. Amon Goeth crashed hard onto the ground. On the second attempt, the executioners miscalculated again. This time the rope was too long, and although Amon Goeth was once again violently choked by the rope during the fall, he also slammed into the ground with full force without dying. Only after he had twice been forced to endure absolute psychological terror and a painful fall did the third attempt succeed. Whether they really miscalculated twice or whether they deliberately wanted to make the notorious Nazi suffer has never been clarified. The same goes for an entire series of hangings that the American executioner John Woods was supposed to carry out on October 16, 1946. He had actually been given the task of executing 10 major war criminals convicted at Nuremberg that day by hanging them with a so-called long drop, a precisely calculated long fall. This would have broken the condemned men's necks instantly. But Woods had built the gallows trapdoors too narrowly and calculated the length of the ropes completely wrong. So when Wilhelm Keitel, the former chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, fell through the hatch, his neck did not break. Instead, a gruesome death struggle began, lasting an unbelievable 24 minutes, while Keitel was slowly and agonizingly strangled. On top of that, during the fall, his face struck the too narrow wooden edge of the trapdoor so hard that he suffered severe head injuries. The former foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop suffered a similar fate. He choked on the rope for more than 10 minutes, when Julius Streicher, the publisher of the anti-Semitic hate newspaper, was brought to the gallows. The flawed construction made him struggle for so long that John Woods went under the platform and pulled down on his feet until he stopped breathing. Whether all of this really happened because of incompetence or because of actual sadism was something John Woods never clarified. While the Americans, at least officially, wanted to give the Nazi criminals a quick and painless death, other nations wanted to see them suffer in public. For the end of Karl Hermann Frank therefore came up with something very special. In May 1946, they turned it into something like a public festival in Prague, with more than 5,000 spectators. The main event was his slow execution. When the moment came, he was strapped to a tall wooden post in front of the excited crowd, and then had a noose placed around his neck. The noose was then pulled upward using a pulley system, slowly choking Karl Hermann Frank more and more until he finally suffocated in front of the crowd. And as terrible as that sounds, the formal executions we have shown you so far were still truly humane compared with what comes next. The most brutal punishments of Nazi criminals happened without any prior trials at all, right after the liberation of the concentration camps. And that is, of course, hardly surprising when you consider that the liberated prisoners finally had the chance to take revenge on their tormentors themselves. One truly extreme incident was documented by the American military lawyer Benjamin Ferencz, who was sent to the Ebensee concentration camp in Austria to collect evidence. There, he personally witnessed a group of emaciated former prisoners tie an SS man to an iron stretcher used for corpses and then push him alive into the hot furnace of a crematorium. Instead of letting him die immediately, they pulled the Nazi out again and again, and then pushed him back into the flames in order to prolong his pain. The punishment of the SS guards also spiraled completely out of control during the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp in April 1945. Although the guards surrendered to the American soldiers, the order "no prisoners" was given. The US soldiers then lined the SS men up against a wall and opened fire with machine guns. At the same time, they also encouraged the liberated prisoners to take justice into their own hands. According to witness reports, the former inmates then beat their tormentors to death with shovels or with their bare hands. All of this was illegal even at the time under US law, which is why there was even a later investigation by the US military leadership. But the investigation report then quietly disappeared. In the end, none of the Americans or former prisoners were ever charged for these cruel punishments. One of the Allies' most brutal methods of punishing Nazis after the Second World War, however, was to simply override international law through bureaucratic tricks. The Geneva Conventions actually regulate exactly how prisoners of war may be treated. But in Denmark and Norway, the Allies simply declared the remaining German troops to be surrendered enemy personnel. Through this trick, the prisoners were left completely without rights and were forced to clear the beaches of landmines. Thousands of young German soldiers, often still almost children, as well as SS men, had to crawl through the minefields on their stomachs without any tools and feel around for mines. In Norway, the Nazis were even forced to march arm in arm through fields that had supposedly already been cleared in order to test with their own body weight whether any mines had been missed. Hundreds were torn to pieces or severely wounded in the process. In the case of SS officer Joachim Peiper, it would even take until 1976 before he was punished. But when it came, it was unbelievably cruel. The high-ranking Nazi had actually already been sentenced to death in 1946, but was later pardoned and released from prison. After that, he lived unnoticed in France under a false name, working as a translator. But after a French newspaper revealed his identity in 1976, he received death threats from the public. And it did not stop there. On the night of July 14th, the French national holiday, unknown attackers assaulted his house with Molotov cocktails. Their goal was to burn Peiper alive. To do that, they threw incendiary devices through the windows, and although Joachim Peiper initially tried to defend himself with a shotgun, he ultimately burned alive inside the building. During the subsequent transport to the morgue, Peiper's head disappeared, only to reappear later in a mutilated state. The perpetrators were never caught. Finally, we want to come to a little-known fact. After the Second World War, it was not only countless Nazis who were brutally punished, but also people from other countries who had cooperated with them. In France, the anger was directed especially at French women who had romantic relationships with the German occupiers. In total, around 20,000 women were dragged out of their apartments and had their heads shaved in public squares. But then did the real torture begin. They were then covered with hot tar and had swastikas burned into their faces with glowing irons. After that, a public humiliation began that seemed almost medieval. After these torments, the women had to walk through crowds of people who spat at them and beat them, and they were marked for life. In isolated cases, some of the women were even grabbed by people in the crowd and strangled. Some eyewitness accounts state, for example, that men grabbed the women by the throat and then watched as they struggled for air. Many of the women eventually took their own lives after these cruel acts. Let us know in the comments what you think of these cases. Leave a like if you found the video interesting and subscribe. Bye, and see you next time.